Hello, everyone. Welcome to our live stream of the Power of Parity, Advancing Women's Equality in Asia. My name is Janet Yang. I'm here to represent Asia Society, which has had a long-standing interest in issues of women and of Asians. And we had been already discussing how great it would be to have a little bit more data on Asian women. And lo and behold, magically, these lovely women from McKinsey Global Institute appeared with a very, very in-depth study that we'd like to share with you today. We are so honored and privileged to have Kweilin Ellingrud, the senior partner at McKinsey, and also Mekala Krishnan, a senior fellow at McKinsey Global Institute, to share with you their findings. I do want to just stop and take a minute and hope that you're all safe and healthy. And while we are not specifically addressing the coronavirus today in our talk, we are sending thoughts to the universe that women around the world are probably struggling more than before with homeschooling and with doing so many of our jobs now simultaneously. It is definitely a challenge, and we think and hope that today's conversation will help us envision a better world where there is more parity for Asian women. So without further ado, I'd like first Kweilin to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about how you came into this study and what your relationship with it has been.
Wonderful. Hi, I'm Kweilin. I am half Chinese and actually grew up in Asia for about 4 years, 3 years in China, living in Nanjing with a local Chinese family, and then a year in Japan as well, going to an all-girls high school. I also have 3 young daughters, a 7-year-old and 4-year-old twins. So this topic is near and dear to my heart from a number of perspectives. And about 5 years ago, in 2015, Mekala and I were the co-authors of Power of Parity globally, where we looked at nearly 100 countries around the world and looked at both the economic impact of greater gender equality and the societal gaps holding women back from participating more fully. And then just last year, 2019, we authored a refresh of that global data and also have done an Asia deep dive that we're going to pull from today to share some of those insights. Mekala?
Thank you, Kweilin. Hello, everyone. My name is Mekala Krishnan. As Janet mentioned, I'm a senior fellow at the McKinsey Global Institute, which is McKinsey & Company's business and economics research arm. And along with Kweilin, have been an author of a whole series of research we've done on the power of parity. The reason I came to this topic had to do with the fact that I grew up in India. So I spent the first 20 years of my life in India. My mother was actually the first female engineer at her college. And I am an engineer by training, so from many different dimensions have been very passionate about how to enhance equality for women and girls globally, and looking forward to sharing some of the insights from our research with you today.
Thank you both so much. We're very, very lucky to have you. So why don't we just dive into this study, which I got a preview of, and there's just some fascinating information. Do you want to get started, Kweilin?
Wonderful. Absolutely. So 3 different lenses that we wanted to walk you through today. First was to put Asia in context with a global view of gender equality around the world, and what does it look like out there for the average woman. Second, we'll go a little bit deeper. Mekala will walk us through Asia-specific highlights across different countries. How does the region look overall? And then we'll narrow in even further into the typical workplace. What are the choke points across the talent pipeline in the typical workplace, and how can we unlock those for women in particular? So first, on the first of those 3 lenses, the global view, let's look at gender equality around the world. If you look and have women participate more equally to men across 3 main dimensions, in terms of, are they participating in the workforce at all? The second is, are they having full-time jobs or part-time jobs? So women around the world have the majority of part-time jobs and the minority of full-time jobs. And third, in terms of sector mix, right? Women tend to be concentrated in lower average output per employee sectors. If you were to equalize those, participation, part-time mix, and sector mix, that is worth $28 trillion around the world. And that's the equivalent of adding the economy of China and Japan, the previous economy, pre-COVID, of China and Japan to the global economy. It's an enormous number, but it's also not a realistic number anytime in the near future because we're not going to achieve full equality over the next 5 or 10 years. And so Mekala and I put our heads together and we said, what is a more realistic scenario? And so to understand that, we looked historically over the last 10 years and said, what is the best rate of improvement, region by region, that we could realistically hope to achieve over the next 10 years? In Europe, Western Europe, that means improving at the rate of Spain. In South America, that means improving at the rate of Argentina, for example. And if you do that region by region around the world, you actually capture about 40% of that $28 trillion opportunity. It's about $12 trillion. And it's the economy of the UK, Germany, and Japan added to global GDP. It's about 11% of global GDP, or about 1% of GDP a year, a significant growth driver, particularly in this environment. And it comes from the 3 sources that I mentioned earlier. About 60% of it comes from more women participating in the workforce who weren't participating before. Another 20% of it comes from part-time mix, and the last 20% of it comes from sector mix. So 60-20-20 in terms of the mix there. That's the global economic opportunity. Then we wanted to look at not just gender equality in work, which you see here on the left side, which is how much of your share of the $12 trillion has your country captured, but we also wanted to understand how does that relate to gender equality in society. And we looked at a bunch of other factors, including essential services and enablers, legal protection and political voice. Are you equally represented in terms of political leadership roles at the overall country level? Do you have the legal protection to vote, to own property, to open a bank account, to own a business without the permission of your father or brother, for example? And then physical security and autonomy. So are you free from violence or harm in those elements? And those 3 categories of metrics, and a number of metrics underneath each of those, we group together into what we call gender equality in society. And it's this relationship that we wanted to understand better. What's the relationship at the country level between gender equality and work on the one hand, so the $12 trillion, and gender equality in society and the laws, the customs, the culture elements that are holding women back from participating more fully. And as we put those together, we created a very simple score, the score between 0 and 1, 1 being perfect equality, 0 being perfect inequality. And we called this the GPS score, gender parity score. And when we first did this work 5 years ago in 2015, gender equality in society was at 66, so 66 out of 100 being the perfect score. Gender equality in work was actually worse, so 51 out of 100% sort of perfect score. And when we updated the data 4 years later to take a look at how much progress had we made, we had basically improved by 1% on each of those dimensions. So virtually the same as we were in 2015. So we haven't made much progress. And we'll talk a bit more about what that looks like on a global basis, but also an Asia-specific basis as well. If you look at the gender parity score by region, on average, right, there's a number of countries, and we'll dive deeper into the Asian countries within this. You've got North America and Western Europe at a 76, again, out of 100 being the perfect equality score. You've got Eastern Europe at a 69. You've got Sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, given a lot of diversity within that, at a 58, 59, and Middle East and North Africa there at a 50. So a lot of variation across the globe, region by region. But the interesting thing is there's a lot of also country-specific variation, and then even within countries, as Mekala will show us, a lot of variation across regions or certain states within. As we looked at the y-axis on this chart, which is gender equality in work, which is how much of that $12 trillion that we were just talking about has your country captured, and then the relationship to the x-axis, which is gender equality in society, which is that lower score of 51 that we were just talking about globally, right? What are the societal gaps, legal protections that are holding women back from participating more equally? What we see is a relatively strong global correlation. Every dot, circle, triangle, square that you see on this page is a different country. And what you see is an R squared of about 60% or so in terms of the relationship between the two. And so if your country wants to capture more of its fair share of that $12 trillion economic opportunity from women participating more fully in the workplace, it's going to have to address many of those societal gaps that are holding women back from doing so. And so this was the connecting the economic opportunity with those societal gaps in laws. The other thing that we did on the global level is take a look at what we call impact zones. And an impact zone is a combination of either a region or a few countries and a particular topic that impacts millions of women around the world. And as we looked into the variability across each of these areas, we found 5 global impact zones, the top half of this page. And we found 5 more regional focused impact zones. The global impact zones are issues that no country, no region around the world have really solved. There are things like blocked economic potential, right? So not as many women working as could be the case. Another global impact zone is unpaid work. Around the world, women do 3 times as much unpaid care work as men. That ranges quite a bit from almost 10 times as much unpaid care work that women do in India versus men to 2.5 times in the United States. But a lot of variability there. And a lot of it is the time that women are spending in unpaid care work that doesn't allow them to more formally enter the workplace or holds them back from doing so. And I've got 3 young daughters. So when I first looked at this data, I thought, wow, I want more unpaid care work, right? I want to spend more time with my daughters and enjoy that time. But it turns out, both in the United States and more broadly, 80% of that work is shopping, cooking, cleaning. It's all of the things that if they were eliminated, automated, shared more equally with partners, right, very few of us would miss it. Only about 15% of that time is time spent with kids, and the last 5%, at least in the US, is time spent with your parents or in-laws. And that mix differs from country to country around the world, but making sure that this unpaid care work is both reduced overall, as we saw with innovations like the dishwasher, the vacuum cleaner over the decades, but also just eliminated, automated, and shared more equally is what we need to see to allow women to free up that time to work more formally in the workplace. Fewer legal rights, we'll talk a bit more about this. Political underrepresentation, only 26 women out of every 100 roles really are held by women at a sort of national level for political representation. And then violence against women. 1 in 3 women around the world experience violence from an intimate partner, right? That's not counting the person in your village that you knew, or somebody that you didn't know altogether. 1 in 3 women from an intimate partner. Interestingly, the United States is at the global average for this number. It's one of the few elements that United States is average in on the gender equality scale. But this was another one of those where nowhere around the world have we really figured it out well. Then we also had 5 regional impact zones. And I think the good news is that if there's a silver lining in all of this, is regional impact zones we fully expect to grow our way out of over time. So as GDP per capita increases in these countries and in these regions, we expect that this will no longer be a challenge from a gender equality perspective. So examples are women being disproportionately concentrated in low quality jobs in India, Middle East, North Africa, South Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. For example, 60% of women in India work in subsistence agriculture, right? So would be a big example of low quality jobs there, often with very low levels of education. Maternal mortality in Sub-Saharan Africa, as GDP per capita improves, we expect that maternal mortality to improve dramatically as well, just as we've seen in the development trajectories of other countries. Unequal education levels in India, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa. We expect that to both improve and potentially flip, as we see in a lot of developed countries. Women actually outperform men academically in terms of secondary and certainly tertiary academic achievement. So in the United States, for example, 57% of college degrees today go to women, right? And they have higher average GPAs on average. They're the majority of valedictorians. Academically, that has flipped to the other direction in terms of gender equality. But regionally, we expect that to change as these countries get a higher average GDP per capita. Financial and digital inclusion in a few of those same targeted areas, India, Sub-Saharan Africa, 190 million fewer women around the world have a bank account. It's also about the same number of fewer women than men who have access to a smartphone, right? Which oftentimes in developing countries now go hand in hand. So what we know is that if a family has one phone, that will typically be held by the man in a traditional family household. If there's a smartphone and an analog phone, typically the man will have the smartphone and the woman will have the analog phone, oftentimes with restrictions on what can be used. And so this is an access challenge, both in terms of digital, but also financial access. And then girl-child vulnerability is improving, but 1.5 missing women every single year. Girls are not even born. Now, with the one-child policy lifting in China, we expect this to improve pretty dramatically, but has been an issue for a while, and we're going to be living with the effects of that now as those children and those cohorts get older. So a set of 5 global impact zones that no country or region has solved, and then a set of 5 regional impact zones that the good news is we will hopefully see more improvement there. I think the other thing, though, to keep in mind is we have seen great acceleration and improvement in some of these regional impact zones. So South Korea, for example, was able to address their missing girls very quickly by having a very multimodal campaign. So they made it illegal for doctors to tell parents the gender of the child. They also went on a whole social media campaign where they had a number of famous people, celebrities and others, showing what was possible in terms of girls in the country, and had other elements that they kind of worked in terms of education, awareness building across the country, and really leapfrogged in terms of their development trajectory in terms of missing girls. So it is possible to accelerate improvement on these regional impact zones as well. Mekala?
Great. Thanks for that, Kweilin. I should have said at the start of this presentation, I'm an engineer by training and Kweilin has studied economics, so we both love data. So there's obviously a lot of data in these presentations, but I think it's really important to understand the baseline of where we're starting from, right? Because that helps us understand, while sobering, it helps us understand where we need to focus attention. And really our goal in doing this was to try and understand where are the gaps in different parts of the world, and where do we as a global community need to focus attention and resources. So with that global perspective, let's now dive a little bit more deeply into Asian countries. There's a lot of detail, again, that we have about specific countries, but what we've tried to do in the next few slides is to summarize that to a few key insights that we hope you can take away. So the first thing is, what is the economic opportunity from advancing the women and girls in Asia? So if you remember to what Kweilin said at the very start, the global number from advancing gender equality for women and girls, not fully bridging gender gaps, but advancing it at the rate of best performing countries, was $12 trillion. Now, about a third of that opportunity, $4.3 trillion, comes specifically from advancing the opportunities for women and girls in Asian countries. That's a significant boost to GDP in these countries, about 12% more GDP in 2025. Is roughly the size of adding Germany and Austria to the global community and to global GDP. And as with the global number, about 60% of that comes from labor force participation. In countries like India, for example, women only make up about 20 to 25% of the labor force. So a huge uplift can be achieved just by getting more women into the labor force to begin with, more women working to begin with. If you move to the next slide, Kweilin, what we've done on the next slide is broken that opportunity out by country. So what you see is the percentage gain that different countries in Asia could achieve in 2025. For example, India has among the biggest opportunities to gain incremental GDP by 2025, more than 15%. China, in absolute terms, in dollar terms, is one of the biggest opportunities in 2025. But if you take a step back and think about this, the kinds of issues these countries are grappling with. On the one hand, we have countries like India that are trying to solve the issue of inclusive growth. How do you achieve growth for all members of society? How do you ensure that women across the board, people across the board, see their income and opportunity lifted? On the other hand, you have countries like Japan that are dealing with a demographic challenge with a largely aging workforce. And this opportunity, the opportunity from advancing women and girls, helps address both kinds of issues. It is a crucial unlock when it comes to thinking about inclusive growth for countries, also a crucial unlock when it comes to thinking about addressing the demographic challenge in more developed countries, in countries that are facing the aging challenge. So if we move to the next slide then, with that economic opportunity lens in mind, let's think about how this actually breaks down in terms of gender equality indicators across Asian countries. So the first thing we looked at is looking at gender equality in work. This is things like, do women participate in the labor force? When they do participate, are they in positions of leadership relative to men? How much unpaid work do they do relative to men? And what we find is that this is a key area that Asian countries are lagging behind. On average, the Asian average we see is 0.45. Remember, a score of 1 is perfect equality, a score of 0 full inequality, compared to a global best of 0.81. So significant opportunity to improve when it comes to gender equality in the workplace. But then when we look at aspects related to gender equality in society, things like essential services and enablers, this is equality in the world of education, equality in the world of health, things like legal protection and political voice, do women have equal rights relative to men? And things like physical security and autonomy, do women experience violence against women? Do women experience increased rates of child marriage? What we find is that across all of these dimensions, Asian countries do have significant opportunity to improve. They are certainly far away on many dimensions from that perfect equality score of 1, and they are also relatively far away from global best-in-class numbers. So on the one hand, it's easy to look at these numbers and feel a sense of sadness or feel like there's a lot at stake here, but I choose to think about this instead as an opportunity. If you think back to one of the slides that Kweilin had shown earlier, which was relating gender equality in society and gender equality in work, what you see here is clearly the opportunity to increase progress on both dimensions and set forth a virtuous cycle where we can capture some of these economic growth opportunities that advancing women and girls presents, and then further enhance women's standing in society and so on and so forth. So let's talk a little bit more about where different Asian countries stand and where the biggest gaps are. If we move to the next page, what we've shown here, and this is quite a busy slide, so I'll talk you through some of the key highlights. What we've shown here is 15 different indicators of gender equality across the different roles. And as you see, again, these are across the dimensions of gender equality in work, as well as gender equality in society. And the data on this chart is showing the number of countries. So for example, when we look at labor force participation rate, that first row, what we see is that 5 Asian countries see extremely high inequality, 6 Asian countries see high inequality, 5 Asian countries see medium inequality. And that leads to an average score for Asia of 0.57. Again, remember, this is a score of 0 to 1. So if you take a look at this slide, a few things stand out, right? Firstly, we see that there are 5 types of issues where on average, this last column, Asian countries see extremely high inequality. And that is on leadership positions where the average score is 0.29, unpaid care work with an average score of 0.26, legal protection 0.47, political representation 0.2, sex ratio at birth 1.1. And in some ways, this is not surprising when you think back to the slide that Kweilin had shown about global issue areas. Many of the issue areas that I highlighted here are the very issues that even developed countries are grappling with. Things like parity in leadership positions or parity in unpaid care work. There are also 5 dimensions where Asian countries see what we call high inequality. This is things like labor force participation, professional and technical jobs, which is our measure for quality, one of our measures for quality work, or things like financial inclusion. And many of these are the regional impact zones that Kweilin was describing on her slide earlier. So in some ways, Asian countries are both facing some of the broader global issues that we see, but also issues that are unique to them. Many of these, the good news is, we have the opportunity to grow out of. Things like maternal mortality, things like financial inclusion. As countries develop, we tend to see that they start to achieve parity on these dimensions. But many of them are issue areas that we need specific concerted action to drive gains, and really no country in the world has solved these issues. So if we move to the next slide. One of the questions we had ahead of time from an audience member was, where do different countries in Asia stand, and which countries are performing the best, which countries are performing the worst. And what we've tried to do on this slide is to lay out that spectrum for a subset of Asian countries. I think this is about 16 different Asian countries. We've primarily chosen to focus on East Asia and South Asia on this slide. We, of course, have data for a broader set of countries if that's of interest to anyone. Happy to follow up later. But what you see here is a spectrum ranging from 0.4 on the one hand in Pakistan all the way to 0.71 on the other end for the Philippines. And so a few things jump out with this, right? The first is the fact that no country, as the global story, no country is close to one. There are large gaps that remain across countries. The second thing that stands out is across Asian countries, we tend to see what we call extremely high or high levels of inequality. That is inequality ranging in the 0.5 to 0.75 or less than 0.5 to 0.75 range of inequality numbers. And so there is significant work to be done across Asia. But what we also see when we compare it with the values in 2015, so this is the bubbles on the very top, is that relative to 2015, we have seen slight improvements in some countries. We have seen some countries slightly worse in their performance, but really the picture hasn't changed. And so in some sense, we may be stuck, and there may be the need to really take a serious look at this issue and drive concerted effort. It is an issue that will take work. In general, as we talk, for example, with companies about this issue, and many companies are now putting in place measures to drive increased diversity and inclusion, we typically find it is a journey of 5 to 10 years to really drive progress. And so this issue will take time. The good news is that as a global community, we are seeing effort towards this issue, primarily driven with the Sustainable Development Goals. So 193 member countries of the UN came together to sign up to quite an ambitious agenda to 2030 to try and advance gender equality as one issue, but a set of issues across the global world, global community related to development. And goal 5 is specifically focused on gender equality. As a result of that, we've seen countries, companies, social sector organizations really start to put energy behind this issue. And the goal is really in the next 10 years to drive significant progress. And so what we hope to do in the later part of this presentation is talk a little bit about how we might think about driving some of that progress. Kweilin, if you move to the next slide. So we talked a little bit about Asia as a whole. We talked a little bit about the spectrum across Asia. And what we see on this slide is the variation within countries in Asia. And so it's important to remember that national averages, looking at an India number, looking at a Korea number, looking at a Japan number, may not give you the full picture of the types of issues we're seeing in a country. And so what we've shown on this chart on the very first column is the variation on that on different dimensions, labor force participation on the one hand, professional and technical jobs on the other hand, of countries across Asia. So firstly, of course, as we've seen on previous slides, we see there is a big spectrum in outcomes across Asia. But then what we've also shown on the subsequent columns is how states or provinces within each of these countries might vary. So let's look at the India column for a second. If we look at the first row, labor force participation rate, we see that there are some states within India that have extremely low parity on labor force participation, scores of 0.1, 0.2. That's on par with the Saudi Arabia. On the other end of the spectrum, though, we see states in India that have a score of a 0.8. That's on par with the Sweden. So think about that. Within India, we have at the same time a Saudi Arabia as we do a Sweden. And so this type of data we hope is helpful when governments, when private sector companies, when social sector institutions really think about where to focus their energy, when we start to look at where to identify best practices, and where to divert resources, right? What are the issue areas that matter in different parts of the country? It is a challenge because this means that oftentimes solutions need to be local. They need to be tailored for their specific context. But at least with these data, we're able to start to say, where do we really need to focus energy and attention? Now, I described that for India. We also see similar outcomes when you think about Indonesia, when we think about Philippines. Just one word on India, and then I'll pull in Kweilin to talk a little bit about China. So I come from India, as I said, originally. And I think this chart certainly shows the variation across states. Some of that has to do with development levels across different states. Some of that has to do with historically matriarchal societies in some states. Some of that has to do with educational attainment in different states. Some states have exceptionally high literacy rates across the board, others don't. I think that the piece that isn't captured on this slide, which I worry about for India, is the urban-rural divide. So the issues that urban India is grappling with are so vastly different from the issues that rural India is grappling with. In many ways, the experiences of women can be similar. I think in both urban and rural India, there are biases that women experience. There are attitudes and social norms to be overcome. But things like the types of economic opportunities that are open to women in urban India, things like the types of educational access that women in urban India might have relative to women in rural India, there are still disparities on those dimensions. And so again, as we think about designing solutions, it's important that we understand those specific local contexts and design solutions that are applicable for women in those specific contexts. One great example from Bangladesh that is quite an intriguing one is the garment industry. So the advent of the garment industry, one of the things that it did for Bangladeshi women is to increase educational attainment. And that was because parents understood that the garment industry employed workers that had at least a high school education. They saw economic opportunity for their girls in the future. And as a result, that incentivized parents to send their girls to school. So it's these kinds of solutions that we need to think about that tackle some of these underlying biases and help pull women forward in areas across the country. Kweilin, do you want to talk about China?
Yeah, I think the other thing that jumps out in what Mekala is describing here, especially as you look at the China column, is how tightly clustered the provinces of China are. We see this also in Eastern European countries, sort of former Soviet Union, former communist countries as well. But it's this sort of centrally driven command and control, kind of more consistency to the economic development and the policies that we see. I think the other element that may be driving some of this greater equality here is decades under Mao Zedong. Some of you may be familiar of, women hold up half the sky, and this notion of any job a man can do, certainly a woman can do as well. And I think that did influence many of the job decisions, careers, kind of opening up a whole host of jobs that might have been unequal for many decades longer, suddenly switched under that philosophy to, we can't afford to do this any other way. We have to have equality for our economy. And that was sort of the forcing mechanism that I think has resulted in quite a bit more equality than we might see in other parts of Asia.
Great, thanks, Kweilin. So if we move to the next slide, then, we've talked a lot about the issues that Asian countries are facing. I don't want to give the picture that there has been no progress. And I think there are many dimensions where we have seen bright spots when we look at over the past 10 years that does give us hope for the future. A few areas that we've highlighted on this slide. The first has been maternal mortality. Really, countries across the world have seen dramatic strides when it comes to this issue. And all the countries that we looked at in Asia have seen improvements on this dimension over the past 10 years. Some of this has been driven by the Millennium Development Goals. So this is the precursor to the Sustainable Development Goals that really motivated countries to take action across the board on issues related to health and education. And that brings me to my second area where we've seen really global progress, but also progress in Asian countries, where most countries have made significant strides across various aspects of education. In countries like India, it has to do with the literacy rate. In other countries like Cambodia and Nepal, we've seen improved secondary school enrollment rates. We've also seen almost every country increase their tertiary school enrollment rates. In fact, if you compare Asian countries to countries in North America and Europe, and frankly, in North America and Europe, we're actually seeing girls exceed the performance of boys when it comes to tertiary enrollment and tertiary graduation rates. So that is hopefully the North Star of the direction that many countries in Asia are also headed towards. On the labor force participation rate, we've seen a little bit of a mixed bag. Some countries have made modest improvements. We've seen other countries lose ground. Some of this may have to do with what economists call the U-shaped curve of development. What we see is that as countries develop, initially, if you see lesser developed countries gain on their GDP per capita, you start to see women actually drop out of the labor force. And that's because as these countries gain in income, the imperative for women to work starts to go away. And so women start to leave the workforce to start to do things like take care of their children, do more of the unpaid care work in the home, etc. Then as we see countries further develop, and this is where many Western European and North American countries might be, you start to see women enter back into the labor force. So beyond a certain level of development, you start to see a reversal, and women that have exited the workforce start to re-enter. And so some Asian countries are at the point where, as they've developed, women have exited the labor force. The hope is through concerted action, as well as their economies continue to grow, women will re-enter. And these will frankly be women that have higher educational attainment, because oftentimes exiting the workforce is to go to school. And so what do we do about all of this? If we move to the next slide, this is sort of a high level picture, and we'll talk a little bit in more detail about specific actions, but the high level perspective on what we can do. And what we find is that there is a set of actions that need to take place, and they all work in a way that can be self-reinforcing. So on the one hand, there is gender equality in society and gender equality in work, the two blue circles on this slide. And this, as Kweilin was saying, these two dimensions tend to go hand in hand. Countries that do well on one dimension tend to do well on the other dimension. We also talked about the role of economic development. Economic development can play a significant role, particularly with enhancing gender equality in society, but also enhancing more broadly gender equality in work. And that is because it allows countries to invest more in healthcare. It allows countries to invest more in education. It allows countries to build better infrastructure. And so these three dimensions working together can lift some boats, but there are also two other pieces that need to fit into this puzzle. One is attitudes and beliefs. As we've talked about a few times now, no country in the world has really bridged all gender gaps. And that is because there are underlying attitudes and beliefs about the role of women versus the role of men that is holding women back in countries across the world. And so we do need to head on tackle underlying attitudes and social norms related to women's participation in society and in the workplace. And then there's this bucket of what we call catalytic forces. So how do we enable any of this to happen? There are about 4 different forces we identified, and many of them at play already in Asian countries, that can help catalyze momentum on these other dimensions. The first is government measures. Government clearly has a role to play when it comes to legal protections. There's a lot of evidence that says changing laws can make a difference whether it comes to women's role in society, women's participation in the workforce, equal pay, etc. The government also, of course, has a role to play in provision of public infrastructure that can help address some of the unpaid work issues that Kweilin was describing. In many countries in Asia, women spend a vast amount of time on things like gathering firewood, gathering drinking water, and public infrastructure has a significant role to play there. The role of technology. We've increasingly seen that things like the internet or smartphones do many things for women. They allow women to have a voice. They allow women access to information across the world. Digital platforms can also help connect women in economic ways to the global community. One example is what we call micro multinationals. The past wave of globalization was really about women, large companies participating in global value chains. But now with things like eBay or Etsy, we have the ability for small entrepreneurs to directly interact with customers across the world. And that brings me to market forces, right? What we find is that there are some interventions that are best performed by government. There are others that the private sector can have a strong role in playing, whether it's designing apps for women, whether it's banks thinking about women as consumers, so on and so forth. There's a range of activities that private sector stakeholders can also undertake. And then finally, the role of social sector institutions, whether that's in advocacy, whether that's in creating awareness of this issue, but really driving movements and large-scale action and energy on this, on these types of issues is a crucial role that social sector institutions can play. So with that, I'll hand back to Kweilin to take us to the end.
Absolutely. Let me hit maybe these last few insights rather quickly. So we did a tour of the global view. Mekala walked us through the Asia-Pacific view. And now I wanted to hit some highlights on the workforce or the workplace in particular. We've done a pretty global view of over 3,000 publicly traded companies across Asia, North America, South America. And what we find is that companies that are in the top quartile of gender diversity on the one hand and ethnic diversity on the other are more likely to outperform in terms of total returns to shareholders. And this is correlation, right? Not causation, but 21% more likely to outperform if you're in the top quartile of gender diversity, and 33% more likely to outperform if you're in the top quartile of ethnic diversity. We also took a look at the pipeline from tertiary sort of university, if you will, colleges and university, into entry-level professions, middle management, kind of that first senior manager role. Senior management, more VP, SVP, C-suite members, direct reports to the CEO, and then board members. And what you see here is countries, some countries are actually quite strong across different countries, and we've got Australia here as a comparison point as well. But around 50% by and large in some countries, as we were describing earlier, over 50%, both for those enrolled as well as graduates. India and Japan being the exception there at 44% and 47%. As you get into the entry level of many of these companies, that's where it starts to drop off pretty dramatically, very dramatically in the case of India, 1 in 4 entry-level professionals being women. But, you know, in Japan, in Singapore, in China, Australia, you know, almost half and half. It's really at this first middle manager level. As we think about management promotions, this is also very unequal in the United States, but 1 in 4 or so, 1 in 5 in China of the middle managers are women, 1 in 3 in Australia, 1 in 10 in Japan, and 1 in 6 or so in India. And then as you get farther along to the right, senior managers, SVPs, C-suite, it gets very, very low, 4% in India, 1% in Japan, and board members along similar lines, a little bit lower in many, many cases. So that's kind of the pipeline of, we're getting the education part right, even up to university. There's a big drop off at entry level, kind of a broken rung or a broken ladder that we can't quite fix, and that the promotion throughout the pipeline is quite unequal, even more unequal in some countries than others. And when we ask why, kind of this needing to be on anytime, anywhere, being available has been one of the biggest challenges that we see across Asia, both men and women saying this anywhere, anytime model is a real barrier for gender diversity, as well as the double burden of sort of working at work and having to take care of a lot outside in the home as well. And with that, the last thing that we wanted to highlight was automation is going to have a differential impact on men and women. What we see is somewhere between 40 million and 160 million women around the world are going to need to make occupational transitions over the next 10 years. So basically 1 in 4 women around the world, in Asia in particular as well, are going to need to switch occupations. And that's more challenging for women. Because they typically have less time to reskill, given our unpaid care work discussion we just had. They have barriers to mobility. They often can't move around as big of a geographic space as men can. They also have less flexibility often, and they also have less access to technology. And so those challenges of changing occupations for those 1 in 4 women are going to be even greater. And with that, I might kind of wrap it up and ask for any questions that we can answer for you or with you if others have thoughts that they'd like to share as well.
I'd like to jump in real quick, first of all. In my world, which is the world of entertainment, we have seen huge progress actually just in the last couple of years in terms of representation of both women and Asians. And that has been amazing. Now, it was fascinating and fantastic that you were able to give this presentation, because it started out looking quite depressing, which is that so little has changed on a very, very broad scale. But like when you dig deep into particular areas in particular countries, there's a lot of room for improvement. What do you see, if I may ask, since this is what I do as a producer, what do you see might be the role of images on screen, large and small screen, in helping catalyze these changes that you call for?
Mekala, why don't you start? I know you have some thoughts on this topic, and then I'll jump in. You're on mute, Mekala.
Oops, sorry. And absolutely, I think it's crucial. If you think back to the diagram that I had shown where we talked about gender equality in society, work, economic development, the fourth thing on that page was attitudes and beliefs. So how do you think about changing attitudes and beliefs? One absolute vital way to do that is to change the mental image people have of different professions, change the mental images that they have of the roles of men versus women. I mean, I'm ashamed to say that if I was to close my eyes as an engineer and think of an engineer, I picture a man, which is, I mean, it just shows how much these biases are ingrained into us from a young age. And so the role of imagery and media in changing that, and changing that from a young age, right? Not changing that in adults, but changing that from the time boys and girls are young. I think that it's almost where we need to start in many ways.
I like to think we're making a difference in our own way. Do you have anything to add to that, Kweilin?
Yeah, I think it's important in movies and kind of who you picture on the screen as you describe, but also in many other dimensions, right? There's a lot of advertising campaigns, for example, like a girl, equal pay campaigns, violence against women campaigns that have really, I think, stepped up to help shape our attitudes, raise awareness. That's such a critical element of this. And when Mekala and I started to categorize very successful efforts, one of our favorite ones is called Bell Bajao, which means ring the bell. And it's a violence against women campaign in India. And I think the important part was they changed laws on the books, but there was very little awareness of those changes in laws that were helping support women who are potential victims of violence. And so they actually created a sort of storyline that they showed across, all of India, and it means ring the bell. If you hear your neighbor beating his wife, ring the bell, ask to borrow some sugar, interrupt what's going on, but don't be a silent bystander. And I think media, kind of, whether they're movies or other campaigns, can have the reach that, individual organizations would only dream of.
Well, that's really good to hear. I know recently there's been a Netflix series called Delhi Crime, and it was about quite a celebrated case of rape in India. And I was surprised because apparently the case itself received quite a bit of attention in India when maybe others might have gone unnoticed. But then the news traveled very quickly around the world, and now there's even a series to document the whole incident. And in fact, the lead of the series is the women police officer. And does something like that have an impact, do you think, in India? Both the case, and why do you think it suddenly garnered so much attention?
Yeah, so that case was, it did garner a lot of attention, and even to this date continues to garner attention. I think, there were a few different reasons. It was, of course, quite a gruesome incident, but it was also the story around it, right? So it was a young girl that had left, I think her family was from rural India, had left India to come to, had left rural India to come to a city in urban India to gain an education. Her family had actually used the money that they would have traditionally spent on her dowry to instead pay for her education. And so it was very much a very moving story and just a horrific incident to have taken place. And so I think the nature of the incident itself. And then I think the good news is, in many ways, there are many things people could say about social media and say about technology, but the good news is it does create platform and reach in a way that we have never seen in the past, right? So actions have a way to be amplified, to spread, to stick in people's minds, and to do so at scale. And all of that happened with this incident. And so I think really, as practitioners in this space, finding ways to utilize mass media, finding ways to utilize platforms to achieve scale, to give voice, to create awareness. It is really our duty to do that with these new technologies.
Is there something similar that's happening in China, Kweilin? I've been following news in China too, and spent a lot of time there. And I saw the beginnings of what you might call a Me Too movement. What do you see as the situation there now on that front?
Yeah, I would say much earlier, perhaps less of an acute issue than perhaps in India and elsewhere. I think the parallels most strongly to what Mekala was describing on social media are most strongly actually here in the US with Me Too, Time's Up, and some of the surges that we've seen there at a really unprecedented rate. In China, I think digital communication, WeChat, WhatsApp, all of that has been in use for a while and has certainly highlighted some issues, but maybe less of a sort of countrywide wave as we've seen here in the US and in some parts of, on some topics in India.
So at Asia Society, we're contemplating an initiative called Asian Women Empowered, AWE, and we're thinking about certain questions that we'd like to address various people. And so you two might be the first that we'd addressed. And your presentation was the ideal way to jumpstart this conversation because you talk about the good news and the bad news. So what would you say, if you could, where Asian women empowered are? How are they empowered and how are they not empowered? When I look at the world as it is today or as it might be after this pandemic, I see, of course, how much better things would be if more Asian women were in power. I think we have a natural capacity for compassion and for collaboration that is lacking in many places, right? So what would you say if you were to answer the question, Asian women are empowered in or because, and Asian women are not empowered because or in, if you could?
I would say Asian women are empowered from an educational perspective, which is so valued in so many, across so many Asian cultures, certainly the way I grew up. And if you look at those, 57% of, for example, the college degrees in the US, as we were describing, if you actually decompose that both by gender and race, Asian American women are outperforming their non-Asian American peers, and women are also outperforming the men. And so it's sort of the double whammy, if you will, or the double positive of that is Asian American women in the US in particular are doing exceptionally well academically, which is both a blessing and a curse to your good news and bad news, right? If you're trying to get into the same set of colleges as your peers, you do have to have higher test scores, higher a whole bunch of other things to get in to the same quality institution, just statistically. Where I see Asian American women less empowered is in the workplace, quite frankly. And I'll share two pieces of data that really struck me. One, McKinsey has done a lot of women in the workplace benchmarking across the US kind of workplace. And what we see is that what starts off at a roughly equal point at the entry level actually drops down really dramatically to only 4% of the C-suite. 4% of people who report to the CEO are women of color, which is Asian women, Black women, and Latina women all added together. 1 out of 25 people who report to the CEO are an Asian, Latino, or Black woman all added together. And so you can imagine it's probably about 1% or so, 1 max 2% of those are Asian women. And I think in addition to being underrepresented at senior levels, they are also much more likely, about 65-ish% of Asian American women have experienced having their idea either taken credit for by somebody else or the credit for their idea given to somebody else. And so I think as we know this, sort of the challenge of being the model minority is that you are often assumed to be a certain way, but assumed to like talk more quietly, not to necessarily stick up and stand up for yourself. And I think that's a challenge that we need to flip.
Yes, it is. Sometimes our very assets are turned against us. Do you have anything to add to that, Mekala?
Yeah, I would say Asian women are empowered in themselves, right? I think oftentimes this conversation becomes one of how do we help women? And I think it's important to realize that these women that we're talking about, every data point in this presentation is an incredible, resilient human being that is living life against all kinds of odds, right? So I'm on the board of a nonprofit organization that works to empower women. And oftentimes our conversation, we need to check our own language because I think we need to realize that this is not about giving power to the weak, but removing barriers that allow people to reach their own opportunities. And in fact, if you take a step back and think about this economic opportunity that we've described, it comes from the fact that people have incredible talent, that women have the ability to lead, that women bring their diverse viewpoints to bear, that is the strength that women bring to any conversation, to any problem, to any challenge. And so I think it's really important for us to realize that. And this asset of resilience, if anything, I feel like if we look at the next 10 years, the next 15 years, the next 20 years, that is going to be the one asset that people will need, that organizations will need, that countries will need, and women will bring that to bear.
That is very interesting. The resilience has allowed us to live through situations that were very unequal. And it is also a part of perhaps our survival skills going forward. So what does McKinsey tell its clients? You've made such a strong case for why there should be more gender parity. What does McKinsey tell its clients, especially, Kweilin, that's the factor that you cite about the big drop off from education to workplace? How does one actually practically change that? More hiring, of course, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee that those women are rising up in the various organizations.
Yeah. We would say two things at the company level. One is set an ambitious target at the overall level, and that might be at the first promotion level that you were describing. That might be in the C-suite, right? Some companies say, I don't like the breadth and depth of my C-suite pipeline and I want to change that. Wherever you need to focus, set an ambitious target and cascade that, and cascade the accountability across the organization by line of business, by function. It doesn't matter what the starting point is, but what is your plan to improve that pretty dramatically and pretty quickly? And the accountability to have that constant conversation of, what progress have we made? What other best practices might you implement? But then breaking that, typically where we see the biggest break point is that first broken rung, right? That first promotion to manager, and then at the most senior levels. And so focusing on where that leaky pipeline is the most dramatic, with the accountability and the sort of aspirational target, is the most powerful.
I have to agree. I'm on the board of the Motion Picture Academy, and I was so impressed because very specific goals were set several years ago to double the number of women and people of color. And I think if you don't make it a mandate, then people can talk about it a lot. They have good intentions, but you're never actively arriving at where you want to be. So I agree that organizations should do the same. I do know that there's I believe a new law now that board members in California at least need to be made up 50% of women, if that's the case. And so that to me sounded like a good step forward. I do have a question for someone now that says, is there any data to indicate that organizations which have more women in senior management and on boards improves the prospects of promotion for other women in the pipeline? Good question from Anjali.
We have not seen enough longitudinal data by company to see that. So we see greater diversity correlated with better economic performance. We have not yet seen that fully correlated because of just a lack of years of observing this with good quality company level data to see what that does to promotion levels. We have looked, and others have looked at this as well. Does a female CEO get more women in the C-suite, for example, or more women on the board? And in some cases we see yes, and in other cases it's just a slight improvement, but not as dramatic as you would imagine, because frankly, sometimes, in the S&P 500, for example, the 5% of those CEOs who are women want to be seen first and foremost as a CEO, not necessarily as a woman. And so we do see a bit of a split experience on that question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that, the two things I would add to that are, one thing that it does is certainly create, one reason to think about these kinds of unlocks is because it creates a specific agenda to promote women, which, as Kweilin was saying, we haven't really seen all that much evidence of. But I think the thing that it can do is create role models. And certainly one of the things, as we've surveyed employees, women employees, that they feel a lack of is people that look like them, right? Whether that is women of color. And so one of the reasons I think companies are thinking about more focused on women in leadership positions is because it creates that role modeling for the rest of the organization. But simultaneously, what we've seen, and Kweilin was referring to this, is if you look at the entire pipeline of a company, the biggest drop-off for women is not in the middle management to VP, it's not in the VP to C-suite, it's not in the C-suite to the CEO, it's that entry level to first promotion.
Mm.
So while focusing on the top is important for the various reasons we just talked about, it's also important to recognize that the biggest drop-off is at the very start of the funnel. And so it's important to understand, for each company, the answer may look different, why that drop-off happens. The one thing I will say about that drop-off is people often say that's because women are leaving the company to go start families. But we found in our data that's frankly not true. What's happening is that women are stuck in specific positions. They're not leaving, they're just stuck.
Mm. Wow, this is a fascinating conversation, and maybe a future one can talk about whether even the existing structures that we're working with are very heavily predisposed to allow men to succeed more than women. And there are a lot of things about women juggling workplace. I like the fact that we're coming into people's homes today from our own homes. So it's from home to home. And there's something about maybe females being more in power will allow us to really incorporate the way that a woman lives more into the workplace. So I think we've run out of time, unfortunately, but this has been a really wonderful conversation. I can't thank you both enough for sharing the data and sharing yourselves with everyone today. And we look forward to seeing you. And for everyone who's tuning in, there is a way to look at this amazing research study. And I believe that's posted online as well. So please do refer to it. And good luck to you both, Kweilin and Mekala. Thank you again for being with us today.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.